Dawn came slowly over the Ardennes, a pale grey light creeping through fog and pine as engines coughed in the cold. On the morning of December 17, 1944, the spearhead of Germany's last great gamble sat motionless near the Belgian village of Honsfeld. Tanks that had been designed to dominate battlefields stood silent, their steel hulls rimed with frost, their crews waiting in disbelief. The offensive had begun less than 24 hours earlier, with thunder and fire. Yet already something more powerful than enemy resistance had brought it to a halt. Joachim Peiper, commander of the armored column chosen to punch through the Allied lines, climbed down from his Tiger tank and looked along the road. He had been told his unit was the decisive point of the operation, the blade meant to cut to the Meuse River and open the way to Antwerp. His men were young, experienced, and confident. His vehicles were the heaviest and most feared in the German arsenal. But the fuel gauges told a different story. They were empty. Around him sat dozens of tanks and half-tracks, engines dead, crews staring at one another in the cold dawn. The silence was unnerving. German doctrine prized momentum, speed, relentless pressure. A panzer force that stopped became vulnerable, exposed to air attack, artillery, and encirclement. Yet this column had not been stopped by enemy fire. It had been stopped by arithmetic. Ahead lay Honsfeld, a small American supply area abandoned in haste during the opening shock of the offensive. Smoke still rose from oil drums where fires burned unattended. Coffee sat cooling in metal cups. It looked as though the defenders had simply vanished. Pieper walked forward cautiously, scanning for traps. What he saw instead felt unreal. Jerry cans stretched across the field in orderly rows, thousands of them, olive drab and stamped with American markings. Fuel. More fuel than his column had been allocated for the entire operation. Men began shouting, laughing, calling others over. Lids were pried open. The smell of gasoline cut through the cold air. Crews moved quickly. Hoses snaked into tanks. Engines drank greedily. The column came back to life. For a moment it felt like a miracle. The entire offensive hinged on fuel. German planners had assumed that once the front was broken, American depots would fall intact, providing what Germany could no longer produce. Here was proof that the gamble might work. Pieper counted cans, estimated volumes, watched as tanks filled, enough perhaps to carry him forward again. Then the realization crept in, quiet and heavy. If the Americans could abandon this much fuel without hesitation, what did that say about their resources? Germany guarded fuel with desperate care. Entire operations were cancelled for lack of it. Civilians had not driven private cars in years. Training flights were rationed to minutes. And yet here, in a forward supply point of no special importance, lay tens of thousands of gallons simply left behind. Pieper did not celebrate. He had spent the war learning that modern combat was not won by bravery alone. On the Eastern Front he had seen armies stall and die when fuel ran out. Tanks without gasoline were nothing more than steel coffins. What lay before him was not reassurance. It was a warning. Months earlier, Albert Speer had stood before Hitler with a report that spelled the end of Germany's ability to wage mechanized war. Allied bombers had systematically dismantled the synthetic fuel plants that kept the Wehrmacht moving. Facilities that once produced hundreds of thousands of tons were reduced to rubble. Output collapsed. Even with Romanian oil fields, Germany's total production was a fraction of what the Allies generated effortlessly. The numbers were stark. In 1944, the United States produced more oil in a single month than Germany could produce in an entire year. American industry did not merely supply its armies, it drowned them in abundance. Pipelines stretched across continents. Tankers crossed oceans. Trucks ran day and night in endless convoys. German planners knew this in theory. They had seen intelligence reports, but knowing numbers on paper was different from standing among the physical proof of them. Honsfeld was not a major depot. It was not Antwerp or Paris. It was a temporary refueling point for a single infantry division, and yet it contained more gasoline than many German divisions had received over months of fighting. As Pieper's men worked, documents were found in a nearby office. Shipping papers traced the journey of the fuel across thousands of miles, from American oil fields to East Coast ports, across the Atlantic, through France, and finally here. The time frame was measured in weeks, not months. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. Newspapers lay scattered nearby, only days old, celebrating the opening of yet another pipeline delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons daily. To German eyes, this bordered on fantasy. Entire German operations had been planned around allocations smaller than what a single American pipeline delivered every day. The column moved out again by midday, engines running, momentum restored, but the clock was ticking. Every mile burned fuel at a terrifying rate. Heavy tanks consumed gallons just to idle. Narrow Ardennes roads caused traffic jams, delays that forced engines to run longer. Unexpected resistance slowed the advance. Each hour eroded the temporary gift that Honsfeld had provided. Further along the route, Piper encountered something worse than enemy fire. He reached Stavelot, the site of a massive American fuel depot. Here lay the prize German planners had envisioned, enough gasoline to guarantee the drive to the Meuse and beyond. But it was already too late. American engineers, warned of the advance, acted without hesitation. They poured gasoline between stacks of cans, laid trails like fuses, and ignited the depot. The result was catastrophic. A wall of flame roared skyward, smoke boiling into the clouds, heat so intense it could be felt from miles away. Millions of gallons burned in a single deliberate act. Piper arrived to find the sky blackened and the air thick with ash. Fuel that could have carried his column to victory was being reduced to smoke before his eyes. The fire burned for days. It was not an accident. It was policy. Across the front, similar scenes unfolded. American units destroyed depot after depot, rather than risk capture. Millions of gallons vanished in controlled infernos. What Germany had gambled everything to seize, the Americans could afford to incinerate without regret. This was the moment the offensive truly failed. Though the fighting would continue, the German plan depended on capturing what the enemy considered expendable. It assumed parity of scarcity. That fuel meant as much to the Americans as it did to Germany. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. While German columns fought, halted, and searched desperately for gasoline, American logistics rolled on uninterrupted. Pipelines pumped fuel inland from the coast. Truck convoys delivered supplies in quantities German officers could scarcely imagine. Even surrounded units received fuel by air in volumes that exceeded what Piper's entire formation possessed. As Piper pushed deeper, the imbalance became undeniable. Tanks were abandoned, not because they were destroyed, but because their fuel tanks were empty. Perfectly functional machines were left behind in ditches and fields, monuments to an economy that could no longer sustain modern war. Piper gathered his officers and spoke plainly. They were not being defeated by superior tactics. They were being crushed by an industrial reality that no courage could overcome. The enemy burned more fuel, denying it, than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. What had seemed like a miracle at Honsfeld was revealed as something else entirely. It was a glimpse behind the curtain, a moment when the true nature of the war became visible. Germany was not fighting another army on equal terms. It was fighting a system that produced abundance on a scale that rendered German scarcity meaningless. The Ardennes Offensive would collapse in days, but the truth discovered among those jerry cans lingered far longer. It spread through German ranks, carried in letters, whispered in prisoner cages, etched into memory. The war was not lost because of a single battle. It was lost because one side measured fuel by the gallon, and the other by the million. As Piper's columns struggled forward, the disparity between the two sides grew sharper with every mile. German fuel consumption was relentless. A Tiger tank burned gallons, simply by existing, its massive engine drinking fuel even at idle. In combat conditions, consumption spiked dramatically. Narrow roads forced vehicles to crawl. Snow and mud increased resistance. Every delay meant engines running, and every running engine meant fewer miles left in the tank. German logistics officers had calculated the risk before the offensive began. The numbers were uncomfortable, but accepted under pressure from above. Hitler demanded a decisive blow, something bold enough to fracture Allied cohesion and force negotiations. Fuel scarcity was treated not as a reason to cancel the plan, but as a challenge to be overcome through speed and captured supplies. But abundance behaves differently from scarcity. For Germany, fuel was irreplaceable. For the Americans, it was renewable, replenished faster than it could be consumed. When German units captured fuel, it felt like salvation. When Americans lost fuel, it was an inconvenience at most. The destruction at Stavelot made this painfully clear. The inferno was not just denial, it was a statement. The Americans were willing to destroy more fuel in a single afternoon than Germany could produce in weeks. To German soldiers watching the flames, this was incomprehensible. They had been taught that America was soft, decadent, wasteful. Now they saw waste on a scale that implied unimaginable strength. Messages intercepted by Allied intelligence confirmed what American commanders already suspected. Piper was critically short of fuel. Orders went out across the front to destroy any gasoline threatened by capture. Engineers prepared demolition charges and incendiaries as routinely as they prepared bridges. Fuel dumps became liabilities rather than assets. Meanwhile, American supply lines continued to function with machine-like regularity. Pipelines laid beneath fields and roads pumped fuel inland day and night. Truck convoys ran on fixed schedules, guided by color-coded routes, their movement controlled by military police who treated logistics like a science. Thousands of vehicles moved supplies forward while consuming fuel at a rate that dwarfed German allocations. This system was not improvised. It was the result of years of planning and industrial coordination. The United States had standardized its vehicles, fuels, and parts. Maintenance was simplified. Repairs were quick. A broken truck was replaced rather than mourned. Fuel flowed not to preserve individual machines, but to sustain momentum. German forces, by contrast, operated a patchwork fleet. Captured vehicles required different fuels and spare parts. Engines designed for lower octane struggled on American gasoline. Maintenance crews worked miracles to keep machines running, but miracles could not refill empty tanks. As Piper advanced, he captured more supplies, but each success revealed the same truth. American fuel was everywhere. Depots marked on captured maps dotted the countryside. Yet for every depot reached, others were destroyed ahead of him. The race became impossible. Fuel was burned faster than it could be seized. The psychological impact was severe. German soldiers began to understand that what they had been told about the enemy was wrong at a fundamental level. This was not a fragile opponent, dependent on careful conservation. This was an adversary whose logistical depth allowed for extravagance, even under pressure. Letters written during these days, later recovered, speak less of fear of American soldiers and more of disbelief at American resources. Men wrote about seeing engines left running for warmth, vehicles abandoned with fuel still in their tanks, supplies discarded because they were surplus. Such sights eroded morale faster than artillery. Piper himself was not immune to this realization. He had built his career on aggressive action, on exploiting enemy weakness through speed and surprise. Now he faced an enemy whose weakness could not be reached by maneuver. Even success carried the seeds of failure. Every captured gallon underscored how little it mattered in the larger equation. By December 18th, the situation was irreversible. Fuel consumption exceeded capture. Tanks were abandoned one by one, not because they were damaged, but because there was no gasoline left to move them. Crews destroyed their own vehicles to prevent capture, an act that felt like betrayal of everything they had trained for. Allied commanders watched this unfold with growing confidence. They did not need to defeat Piper tactically. Time and logistics were already doing the work. American units maneuvered freely, redeploying entire formations with fuel expenditures that would have immobilized German armies for weeks. As the weather cleared, Allied aircraft returned in force. Each sortie consumed fuel at rates that highlighted the imbalance even further. German pilots watched from the ground, grounded not by enemy fire, but by empty storage tanks. Air superiority was not just a matter of aircraft, it was a matter of gasoline. The Ardennes, once chosen as the place where Germany might gamble everything, became the place where the truth could no longer be denied. Industrial warfare had reached a point where courage, experience, and tactical skill could not overcome production ratios. One side fought constrained by scarcity, the other fought backed by abundance so vast it could afford destruction. Piper's column continued to shrink, not through decisive battles, but through attrition by emptiness. Each mile forward brought them closer to encirclement and farther from any hope of resupply. The offensive that was meant to restore German fortunes instead stripped away the last illusions of parity. In these days, the war changed for those who lived it. It ceased to be about seizing ground or outmaneuvering the enemy. It became a lesson in inevitability. The Germans were not losing because they lacked skill. They were losing because the enemy's industrial engine operated on a scale that made resistance mathematically futile. By December 19th, the remnants of Piper's spearhead were no longer an advancing force but a trapped formation. American units closed in from multiple directions, moving with a freedom that bordered on casual. They maneuvered tanks, infantry, and artillery without concern for distance or consumption. Orders were issued, routes plotted, and columns rolled. Fuel was assumed. For Piper, fuel was a question asked before every decision, a limit that shaped every move. Reports filtered back through German command channels, each one darker than the last. Attempts to push forward stalled within hours. Retreats were equally constrained. Tanks could not fall back if they could not move. Fuel convoys promised from the rear were destroyed by Allied aircraft almost as soon as they appeared on the roads. The skies belonged entirely to the enemy now, and every German vehicle that moved in daylight risked annihilation. Pieper gathered his officers again. What fuel remained was pooled, measured, argued over. It amounted to only a few thousand gallons, enough for a brief fight or a limited withdrawal, but not both. Choices that commanders once made based on terrain and enemy strength were now dictated by the needle on a gauge. Around them, American forces tightened the noose. Infantry units supported by armor advanced deliberately, confident that supplies would follow. Artillery batteries fired without restraint. Where German gunners counted shells, American batteries planned fires in terms of hours rather than rounds. Fuel trucks moved up behind the lines, engines idling, waiting to refill vehicles that still had fuel left. The contrast was not lost on anyone who saw it. German prisoners taken during these days often spoke less about fear of American weapons and more about shock at American logistics. They watched soldiers discard half-eaten rations, burn fuel to keep warm, and run engines for convenience rather than necessity. Each observation chipped away at the belief that the war could still be turned. As the encirclement closed, Piper ordered the destruction of vehicles that could no longer move. Crews set charges, disabled guns, and torched equipment. Perfectly functional tanks were reduced to wreckage, not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The sound of explosions echoed through the forest, the death throes of machines that had never truly been defeated. On December 21st, the situation reached its breaking point. Piper's remaining forces were surrounded near La Glaise. American units facing them had access to hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel for that single day's operations. Piper's entire command possessed barely enough gasoline to move a handful of vehicles a few kilometers. The imbalance was grotesque. American soldiers rode home with a mixture of curiosity and dark humor. They joked about Germans who had run out of gas, treating the situation as an oddity rather than a triumph. For them, fuel shortages were unthinkable. The idea that an entire armored column could be immobilized by lack of gasoline seemed almost absurd. Above the battlefield, Allied aircraft flew continuous missions as the weather cleared. Fighters and bombers burned fuel at rates that would have grounded the German Air Force indefinitely. Each day of Allied air operations consumed more fuel than Germany had allocated for its entire offensive. The sky itself became a demonstration of industrial power. On the night of December 23rd, Pieper made his final decision. The vehicles were abandoned. The men would escape on foot, under cover of darkness, carrying only what they could. Tanks that represented years of design, production, and training were destroyed in minutes. The commander's own tank was blown apart by its crew. It was the final admission that the gamble had failed. Of the thousands of men who began the offensive under Pieper's command, only a fraction would return. They had advanced miles into enemy territory, captured supplies, and fought hard battles. Yet their fate had been sealed before the first shot was fired. In factories and refineries thousands of miles away, news of what had happened spread quickly through German command. Reports detailed the quantities of fuel captured and destroyed by the Americans. Senior officers read the figures twice, then again. Millions of gallons burned deliberately, tens of thousands captured without effort. The scale defied belief. Some refused to accept it. Hitler dismissed the reports as exaggeration or deception, clinging to the idea that willpower could overcome material disadvantage. Others understood immediately. They recognized that the Ardennes offensive had not failed because of weather or resistance, but because Germany was no longer capable of sustaining modern war. Letters written by German soldiers during this period reflect a profound shift. Men who had endured years of hardship now expressed fatalism. They wrote of an enemy whose resources seemed infinite, whose waste exceeded German supply. Censorship could not fully contain these impressions. Morale eroded quietly, relentlessly. After the battle, Allied salvage teams surveyed the battlefield. They catalogued abandoned German equipment, noting with bureaucratic detachment that many vehicles were intact and repairable. One report recorded that a few thousand gallons of fuel would have been enough to recover dozens of tanks. The fuel required was trivial by Allied standards, easily drawn from local reserves. What had been impossible for the Germans was barely worth noting for the Americans. The Ardennes marked the last German offensive of the war. After it failed, the conflict became a steady retreat, punctuated by localized resistance. Fuel shortages worsened as Allied bombing intensified. By early 1945, German production had nearly ceased. Aircraft sat idle. Tanks were moved by rail when possible, then abandoned. Entire units surrendered, without fighting because they could not move. American forces, by contrast, advanced with momentum limited only by traffic congestion. Columns stretched for miles, vehicles bumper to bumper, a mechanical river flowing east. Fuel consumption was enormous, yet supplies kept pace. The war became an exercise in movement and pressure, a demonstration of industrial capacity translated into operational freedom. Years later, historians would analyze the Ardennes in terms of tactics and leadership. They would debate decisions, timings, and missed opportunities. But beneath every analysis lay a simpler truth. The outcome was determined not on the battlefield, but in the balance sheets of production and the output of refineries. The experience of Piper's column stands as a stark illustration of that reality. When the Germans discovered American fuel at Honsfeld, they believed they had found salvation. Instead, they discovered irrelevance. The quantities that meant survival to them were insignificant to their enemy. This realization changed the war for those who lived it. It stripped away the last illusions of equality. The German army had once relied on speed, skill, and audacity to offset material disadvantage. By 1944, the disadvantage had grown too large. No amount of daring could bridge the gap between scarcity and abundance. The Ardennes Offensive did not simply fail. It exposed the limits of courage in an industrial age. It showed that wars between modern powers are not decided by individual brilliance alone, but by systems capable of sustaining effort at scale. In that contest, Germany had been outmatched long before the first tanks rolled into the snow.